Hello, everyone. Wonderful to see all of you. We have a great turnout this afternoon. Since so many people seem to be joining all at the last minute, let's give it another couple of minutes and then we'll start. Hi, Mike. Are you all set?
I'm squared away. My technology's working today, so I'm very happy.
Yay. Well, it's time, so I think we'll go ahead and start now. Welcome, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to have you here this evening. I'm Deirdre Mendez. I'm the director of the Center for Global Business at the McCombs School at the University of Texas at Austin. And I could not be more excited to have Mike Kelly here as our guest speaker. Mike is a longtime supporter of our center and our students and our effort. I think he's far and away the most popular mentor we have. He's been mentoring students as long as anyone, and has just done so many wonderful things for us already. And he actually is in a new position, which is really exciting because it's with a fantastic company with a new business model doing work that is so relevant to all the things we care about, as well as consider interesting and important in the global economy, also something that's near to all our hearts, I think, because it has a very strong environmental application. So, Mike, thank you very, very much once again for joining us.
Thank you very much for those kind words. I appreciate it. I'm very excited to be here. So with that, I am Mike Kelly. I am a McCombs graduate. Way back when from '85, international business major. Okay. And then a few years after my graduation from UT, I went on to Thunderbird to get my international MBA degree there, and have since pursued a long and adventurous career in international work. And so my role today is with a company based here in Austin called SeekOps. I'm a director for business development for the Americas. And so my region covers the US, the Caribbean, and Latin America. And what I do is I support business development and operations in our business. So in a nutshell, what SeekOps does is we're in the business of detecting, locating, and quantifying methane emissions. We provide methane emissions data, and that is useful and needed in the market vertical of greenhouse gas emissions reduction, specifically methane. So our core business is data analysis, and it's based upon a proprietary sensor that we have developed, and it is a drone-based sensor. And so in essence, I'll just hold this up briefly to give you a size. It's getting washed out on my screen, but it's the size of a ballpark hot dog. It's not that large. And it's mounted on a drone. And our business model is to deploy this sensor with a drone around various sites on the globe and take actual site measurements of methane emissions, integrate that information with weather and wind conditions on the sites. We send that up to the cloud. It comes here to Austin. And we have a team of environmental data scientists, atmospheric scientists, and with a proprietary algorithm set of software, we integrate that data and produce a report that shows an operator where they're leaking methane emissions and how much.
Well, that is, am I interrupting you?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, so I think that's such a fascinating business model. And one of the questions I wanted you one of the things I just wanted you to talk about briefly is what kinds of companies need this service and why?
Good question. So our market verticals that we work in are oil and gas, upstream and midstream, renewable natural gas. This is the production of biomethane from agricultural waste, food waste, landfill gas and also in landfills. So the primary drivers for a lot of our business, particularly in oil and gas, is a regulatory framework, a voluntary framework called the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0. And so this is a voluntary framework for reporting and measuring actual methane emissions on sites that are operated by international oil and gas companies around the globe. So this OGMP 2.0, as it's referred to, consists of some 70 to 75 companies who prescribe to this voluntary framework, and they agree to measure and report their methane emissions and then go about reducing them in a prescribed manner. And why methane? Methane is important because in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, methane does far more damage to the environment or the atmosphere than CO2, even though methane has a shorter life in the atmosphere. Specifically in Europe, the European Union has made it compulsory for these oil and gas producers to actually go out and measure their methane emissions, report them in a transparent manner, manage them, and reduce them. So they have made corporate CEO commitments to eliminating methane emissions down to near zero. And you can see this in companies such as BP, Shell, Repsol. The various CEOs have made a corporate public commitment. They have set aside resources, meaning funding and people, to go out on their assets around the globe and to take these measurements and report back.
Okay, so there are companies that are being good corporate citizens, and also ones that are responding to various kinds of pressure and sort of competing with other companies that might be doing this to shore up their reputation. So hopefully it's kind of a virtuous cycle.
And you're right. And so what's interesting about this regulatory framework, it's not straightforward. It's not, it's different from region to region. So in Europe, it's very OGMP 2.0 based. You come to the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency released a draft methane emissions framework about a year ago. They asked for industry input. They've received it, but they've yet to finalize those guidelines for methane emissions here in the United States. So there's not this regulatory driver for methane emissions as much in the US as there are in Europe. On the other hand, we are seeing that there's a lot of pressure from equity investors, private firms, to report out their methane emissions in terms of ESG. There's ESG metrics. You're seeing a lot of this, for example, in the US with engine number one Capital, who has made movements at the board level of ExxonMobil and then moved these companies to join OGMP 2.0. And when you go to other parts of the world, for example, in Latin America, where I work with frequently, when you get down to the national levels, at the environmental agency levels, a lot of these countries are signatories to COP26, yet they've not promulgated or defined their emissions programs. And so there's no real driver necessarily. So It's a mixed bag.
And that's so fascinating. I think that's really the case in so many different areas right now. Regulations are not standardized, and things are also changing very rapidly. We're in transition in so many ways. So this is the kind of operation, the kind of environment that global companies are operating in. They're having to change and be responsive, and lots of different sources of pressure and so on. So Mike, you said that you use a drone technology to detect and notify companies of gas emissions. So one of the things I'm curious about is your business model in country, because what are your relationships? When we talked before, you described some very complicated relationships with other companies and with your clients and also with governments. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. And so this is, for me, this touches on my area of interest and passion for international work and international business. So our business model is such that we're here in Austin. Probably 70 to 75% of our activity is outside the United States. And we are not in the drone business. We are in the data analyst business, analysis, and the sensor business. And so what we do is we go to these different regions around the world, and we find that regional drone service companies, industrial grade drone companies, not the hobby shop types. And we will train them in the United States, send our sensor down to their country, work alongside them for their first few surveys, and then we license them to do surveys in the region with our sensor. And they contract locally with the local international oil and gas companies as a local business entity, if you will. And then they take the data that they receive, obtain on the site, and send it up to the cloud. It goes back to Austin, and we send a report. So we push down the operational activities to the regions. And what happens is that sets up a whole nother area in that logistically, it is challenging to execute those operations. So in terms of our global footprint, when we look at our company compared to other similar technologies, we're probably the leading global company in this field, in that we do work in UK, European continent, Middle East, Africa, Asia Pacific, Australia, and Latin America. And so we engage in local companies. And then when we find a project, for example, with one of these European oil and gas companies, it becomes very interesting in that we will often engage in high level discussions, technology, operations with the corporate offices in Europe. Supply chain comes out of Europe, yet the work may be executed in Bolivia or Argentina. So we have to take into account local Argentine or local Bolivian trade practices, commercial activities, languages, contracting, and there's quite a bit of work that goes into that. And that's only for onshore work. We do a lot of work offshore. That is fixed production platforms or floating production, storage and offloading ships. And when you're working offshore, as an example, that becomes quite complex in that when you're working offshore on an active production platform, you step into the realm of weather, transportation via helicopter, ship, then you get into simultaneous operations and hazardous ID reviews and so forth. And there's a whole different level of complexity there.
Wow. So one of the things that that I talk about in my classes is local content restrictions. And you mentioned that you actually had a model that was a little bit different from some of the things that I've seen. So would you describe that a little bit? You were talking about your relationships with local companies.
So, for example, when we work with some of these international oil and gas companies, and they need to take this on-site measurements of methane emissions for the OGMP reporting purposes, they'll need to do initial surveys and then go back and do repeat surveys of their emissions. So what we're doing is we are training and certifying a local company in country with this technology. They fly our sensors. It's a particular skill set with this. They learn our technology and our reporting processes to a degree. And then we push that business down to them in country. And then they, in turn, we're educating the local companies, promulgating new technology, helping them with their emissions reduction, and that emissions reduction technology and our survey technology can be used for other market verticals in that country. And then more importantly, for us as a business, on the supply chain side, it makes it a bit easier for us because now that work is being executed between a local in-country company who flies a survey and the local business unit of that international conglomerate.
And I would assume that the governments of the countries where you're doing this kind of where you have these kinds of relationships is pretty happy about that.
Yes, it's understood. It's not an overt statement, but yes, they're quite pleased. And then, as an example, I'm recently working on a project in Latin America. We're looking at bringing in equipment and people into this country to execute a service using American-based equipment, and the host country imposes a 25% tax on foreign equipment and service people coming into the country. So we couldn't pass that cost on to the operator, so we had to find a workaround with a local company for that. So we come into issues like that.
Mm-hmm. So all of this is pretty complicated, and it's maybe complicated is not the word I want. It's really diverse.
Yep.
You're working on the technology side, and you've got relationships. I know you have a very extensive background working really globally for many years. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, I really enjoy international work. I enjoy working in different countries, and through the course of my career, I've been fortunate to work in Europe, Africa, the Mideast, Asia Pacific, Australia. And then just by proximity to being in Houston in the oil and gas business, I've worked extensively in many countries in Latin America, running service operations and local businesses. And so I myself particularly enjoy that. I have a passion for foreign languages. So in the case of Latin America, I speak Spanish and Portuguese, and that's something that I weave into my day-to-day business. So during the course of my operations work, my commercial discussions, I'm constantly using my Spanish and Portuguese. So it weaves in very nicely.
So speaking in terms of, you mentioned languages, what other types of skills do you have and do you need to do this kind of work? Because I think one of the questions, we've got a very diverse audience this evening, but I know that my students are always interested in getting a sense of what kinds of skills are helpful and important in the global arena. And I have a sense that you use so many different ones. So would you just kind of describe the kinds of work you do in different components of your work and the different skills that you need to bring to that? In addition to, and would you say that foreign languages are important and helpful in your work? Because I always like to give a shout out to foreign languages.
So yes, foreign languages, that's my first and foremost recommendation. If you can obtain a basic practical speaking level of a foreign language that you can use in your work overseas, absolutely. That really changes the tone and the pace of your communication and the ability to understand people. And there's different levels of fluency there, but that's first and foremost. So I can't emphasize that enough. And that takes work to learn a language. It's not something you can do overnight usually. In terms of other skills, these are things that I've just kind of learned over the years. First and foremost is listening. Do more listening than talking, but it's important to listen within the cultural context of the country that you're working in. So, for example, the Mexican culture is different from the Brazilian culture and so forth. And you're very familiar with this. You've written on this. So that's truly important. And trying to accomplish your business objectives within that context of the culture is very challenging at times, because everybody has their own jobs and needs that they're trying to get done, and they're doing it their way. It's kind of a minor point. I recall vividly in one of these countries I worked in, where I was working on a technical solution that would have made an operation easier, more effective, and less costly. And the response I got back after a lot of questioning was, well, why would I want to do that? Because my job is to employ as many people as possible here in this region. Like, you have a good point. So it's like, okay, so we won't talk about that. So, but apart from the listening, the language skills, yes, I think basic understanding of international trade, foreign exchange, logistics in particular, shipping, Incoterms, I deal with that frequently. A good awareness of FCPA is really important. Just to have your eyes wide open as you process through your communications and you cycle through your work, that you kind of keep your antenna up for FCPA issues.
And FCPA is the
Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Thank you.
Yes, I cannot speak enough about that. So, and then, you know, in business, a good fundamental understanding of profit and loss, P&L. Because as you're working through these different markets, I mean, it's a business, you're here for P&L, and you've got to keep an eye on the P&L. So, yeah.
Okay, so accounting, language, regulatory awareness. What about, do you have any technology responsibilities?
So yes, having a technical skill is very useful. In my case, I took an international business path. I tried mechanical engineering out when I was first at Texas. It didn't fit. I found out the hard way. But the irony is I wound up working in technical services. And through the course of my career, just through sheer work and effort, I've picked up some basic skill sets that are applicable to certain industries. So yes, a baseline technical skill set is very useful. You cannot go wrong with that.
Okay, super. I'm looking at the questions that are coming in the chat. We have some really good ones. I want to start with one basic one just to help us help ground the discussion, because I think if everyone's not familiar with methane emissions, it might be helpful to explain, first of all, what are the top sources of methane emissions? Why are they, you said they're a greenhouse gas, so we know that they're bad for that reason. And then how do the drones detect that? So just to give us a little bit of an overview of what you're telling your customers.
Sure. So our sensor it sniffs a plume of methane downwind of a source. So we circle a site, a platform, methane blows downwind, we detect the plume of methane, and then we fly a curtain pattern. We take a 3D point cloud collection of the plume, map that, and then we integrate that with the wind speed and vector data. And then we run that through some atmospheric modeling and some Gaussian chain analysis. And we produce a localization. Okay. So the methane itself, the sources of it, in terms of oil and gas production, can be from unplanned or planned venting or flaring of excess gas in a production process. Can come from leaks from equipment. A lot of equipment in the field is old and needs to be replaced. And then there can be startups, and starting and stopping equipment in the field can generate a lot. So a lot of these leaks in the oil and gas, the majority of them, can be mitigated, not eliminated, through leak detection and repair and through minimizing or eliminating venting and flaring. In the biogas space, which is an interesting market, that's renewable natural gas. So biogas is a new market that is just really taking off. And what this is taking methane gas produced from agricultural waste, biomass, crop waste, animal waste, running that through a anaerobic digestion process, purifying that, and that becomes literally a drop-in natural gas that can be used for power generation. It can be used for powering vehicles as compressed gas, electricity. It's just a wide range of applications. And so that comes from animal, dairy farms, beef production, and many other agricultural sources. Landfill gas is another area. Actually, methane emissions from landfills can be very significant. And so in many countries, including the United States, on the covered part of the landfill, there are wells, pieces of pipe that are put into the soil. Methane gas is produced by the landfill from the decomposition, and that gas is taken out and then purified and used as a fuel source.
Okay, thank you. I'm learning a lot here too. And we have another good question, which is on a very different topic. What problems, if any, have you run into working with nationalized oil companies like Pemex in Mexico, for example? compared to privatized companies?
It's a good question. So as Pemex, an example, they've long been a national oil company. They have a particular supply chain system, a bureaucracy like all companies. And in Pemex in particular, as in a lot of national oil companies, they have budget cycles. So in the case of Pemex, as an example, their operational budget must be approved by Congress on an annual basis. And so that in turn impacts their ability to go out and execute maintenance projects, capital projects, because they've got to go through a very clearly defined procurement process. Monies have to be approved. And so it can take longer compared to a private company where it's much shorter on the decision cycle, typically.
Okay. Another good question. Do you find that attitudes towards your products or sustainability in general vary from country to country or region to region? And I was curious, we talked about this earlier, and it's kind of interesting to look at the regions where your customers typically come from and why. So
it's a good question, because actually in my part of the world, in the Americas, the Latin American countries tend to be more open and receptive to new technologies and trying things out than the American companies. The American companies are very reluctant to try new technologies in many respects, for good reason in many cases. But typically, a lot of companies have something that works. They know it. They're familiar with it. They've got very specific operating budgets, and they're not so open to innovation necessarily. And so they may want to see a peer company try this out first before they do. But typically in Latin America, I find these companies to be more quick to accept and try out new technologies than American companies.
okay, thank you. And we've had several questions about COVID and what effect it had on the work that you're doing and how you do your work. Obviously there were border closings and people couldn't travel and so on. So what implications did that have for you?
Oh, wow. So for myself personally in my work, I've been with SeekOps for a year. Prior to that, this role, I was in the downstream oil storage business. I was a global business development manager. I did a lot of work in the Mideast, Africa, and Asia Pacific. And as a consequence of COVID, my business went to zero. Just because companies shut down, they'd close operations, they were skeleton crews, and so it was extremely severe. And a lot of that business didn't come back. In the business here at SeekOps, there were some quarantine requirements. When companies start up work again, so in field operations, we would have to send people in the field. They'd be required to go into a hotel and stay for 2 days in quarantine and then test before they could go out and do their work. And then you still see some companies requiring that the field people you send out to work on their assets must be vaccinated, have proof of vaccination, and be boosted, at least with one booster. So there's still remnants of that. It is tapered off and in many respects almost gone away.
Okay, thank you. I'm going through these, and my own focus, Mike, as you well know, we actually met in a cultural context. My own focus is intercultural relations. So I've been tending to sort of not ask those questions just because I don't want to emphasize those, but there's so many questions about this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure exactly how to ask this, but how do cultural factors show up? We've had some questions about cultural factors in negotiations. Could you give a couple of examples of cultural issues that you've faced and maybe how you've dealt with them and how important you think that is?
It's very important. So there are some cultures in some countries in particular I've experienced where I've learned where they will never say no. They mean no. No is the answer, but they won't tell you that. So it takes a series of conversations, a series of questions to ascertain that. Okay. Then the other part of this is like, say, allowing people on the other side of the table or you work with to save face. You don't have confrontation. You don't challenge them. I always make an effort to remember that I am a guest in their country. I am a guest. It's my responsibility to understand their cultural norms and work within their norms and try to understand what they're trying to accomplish. As an American, it's my opinion, we Americans tend to be very impatient and direct. And so you know this, you're Asia Pacific background, so you can't do that. So I recently was in a large meeting 2 weeks ago where we had stakeholders in Brazil, Europe, and we had some challenging questions brought up, but I deliberately chose not to challenge people on the call, just to allow people to save face. So it was a very measured, so you take a very measured approach in your discussions.
Well, I think that's good advice for any situation wherever you might be in the world. And I'm sure you could say a lot more about that if we have more time. Let me ask, here's an interesting one. Have you ever worked in a country where the political and economic or legal situation was unstable? If so, what means do you use to deal with these instabilities, and how has it impacted your business?
Yes. And so it was years ago in Venezuela. And so running a service operation in Venezuela. And then the case in point in that, I had to collect payment on a past due invoice. And so it was pretty significant invoice, owed me in dollars. I did a service, they weren't paying. And it took me 8 to 12 months and multiple visits, meeting people in person and persuading them to pay me. And then it was a lot of visits to restaurants and talking to people with bodyguards, guns around, this kind of thing. I never felt threatened or endangered, but there was a lot of, there was a lot of challenge there. And so at least when it comes to getting paid in these countries, I'm very attuned to it. One, how stable is the monetary system, the banking system in this country? Are there foreign exchange controls? This customer I'm doing business with, how are they going to fund this project? How are they going to pay me? Am I going to get paid out of a bank in Miami? Are they going to pay me out of a bank in Europe? How difficult is it for them to get cash or US dollars to affect a transaction?
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. What are next steps or projects the company is seeking to expand into as technology advances and climate change become more of a problem?
So for our company, our next phase is CO2. So we have a CO2 sensor, is very much like what we have for our methane sensor. And we've taken it through some prototype trials. We'll probably have that in the field and rolled out next year. So we get a lot of requests for CO2 sensing and data analysis.
Okay. And more culture-related questions. So here's one while I read up on some of the others that are coming in. How do you prepare to do business in a new country or a new cultural environment?
So I actually do stop and take time to understand and study up on some of the high-level cultural norms. Look at the economic fact book. The CIA's got this open source on the web. It's really great. I look at other sources, and then I run through business communication and correspondence with people in that country before I begin to do business. And then I'll sort out some of my contacts and networks from over the years. And so like doing business in the Middle East is extremely different than doing work in Brazil or the United States for that matter, or Asia. So.
All right, and we have more questions about language skills. So I guess I'm just going to give you another opportunity to say that language skills are important.
Yeah, I cannot emphasize that enough. So again, so my passion was driven my career as foreign languages. So early on, I studied multiple foreign languages and settled on French. And I studied economic and commercial French at Thunderbird, got out of Thunderbird, and I went to work for a French multinational. I was there for 6 years and I spoke more French than English. And so I just really enjoyed that, using that foreign language, the cultural, cross-cultural context with the international business components. And then,
So would this be a good time to put in a plug for international business education?
oh, I can't emphasize that enough. Yes, it's very valuable, very valuable. It pulls you up a couple levels up against your competition to have that baseline understanding. And then if you've got a foreign language skill applicable to the area you're working in, that's just a multiplier. Because I kind of liken a foreign language to going into a house. So if you speak a basic level of the foreign language, you get into the ground floor. If you've got a medium level proficiency, that gets you up to the second floor. If you're fluent, you dream in the language at night, you can read and write it, then that's the third floor. And what that does is that opens up the cultural context of the language, because there's all the nuances. When you're talking to people, there's nuances in the accents and in the facial expressions that will really convey a lot. I mean, much like our own language. So that makes a very big difference. So yes, an IB major with a foreign language is very powerful.
Okay, thank you. We've had a number of questions about countries that are difficult, easy or difficult to work in, regions that you found difficult to work in. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, sure. There are some countries that are more challenging than others. West Africa can be very challenging for many reasons. Sub-Saharan Africa, they're just not as developed and advanced economically. They don't have the infrastructure. Latin America, a lot of the countries have vacillated between different levels of infrastructure capabilities and laws and so forth. So it just varies. I enjoy them all. And actually, for me, the more challenging the country, the more I enjoy it.
Okay, marvelous. Let's look at some others. What are some criteria that you use to determine which countries you want to work with? So it's my understanding, and this feeds into a different question, which is another question that we received, which is how do you look for business? Where do you look for business? Does it come to you? What are your what is your business model in terms of seeking business?
So, as a business development person, what we're always looking to do is to find situations where somebody either needs to fix something, accomplish something, or avoid it. One of those three things. So they've got a need. Then we sort out what we offer. Does it fit what their needs are? That's very high level generic. So in the case of SeekOps and our methane emissions capabilities data analysis, we're driven by companies who need to find their methane emission leaks, quantify them, and eliminate them. And then so we'll work with those companies who may be national companies, maybe medium companies in a region, they may be international, and they have a mandate to do that. So that drives that activity, and they've got funding. In terms of complexity, yes, there are some countries that are just simply more challenging than others. So Argentina, as a case in point, they have foreign exchange controls. So it is very difficult, if not impossible, to repatriate funding out of Argentina. So as an example, my partner company in Argentina has a bank account in Spain. So we're conducting our transactions from the US to Spain. We're not doing this between the US and Argentina because they just can't get their funding out of Argentina.
Yeah, so you're not selling breakfast cereal or anything as a trade offset. You're able to just leverage banking relationships in other countries. That's very helpful.
Yes, that's very important. At the end of the day, how are you going to get paid? That P&L.
And if you get paid there, can you get it out?
It can be challenging. Some currencies are easier to convert to dollars as others, and then you can, if an organization is large enough, they can go into forward contracts for foreign exchange. I've been in companies where we did that. So I had revenue that was in my backlog, and I was expecting to execute and invoice this in the coming 12 months. In Mexico as an example, so then we would take out a 90-day forward contract on pesos to the dollar to lock down an exchange rate.
Okay.
So.
Do you feel you have reporting partners or financial partners that understand your business and help your clients gain credit for your work?
So if we're speaking about carbon credits, perhaps maybe this question is around carbon credits. So there are markets where carbon credits are absolutely important. They're financial drivers. So in the biogas market, in the United States, as an example, there are carbon credits that are issued in California for methane that is produced from agricultural waste. And so any methane that they produce has a very high product value in the market. And so the operators and owners of that equipment and that biomethane are very motivated to find and fix all their leaks because they get carbon credits for that. In the case of oil and gas, it's the drivers we're seeing primarily is the OGMP 2.0, and that's being driven by the European Union. Not so much carbon credits, but mostly the OGMP 2.0 reporting.
Okay.
But that's coming. Carbon credits, that's coming. It's generally understood in the business.
And are there technologies that you see coming that will facilitate the work that you're doing, or related work, or what do you see on the horizon?
So in this space of emissions detection technologies and mitigation, there's an explosion of new technologies and companies out there every year. And it's very challenging for these operators to sort through those technologies that will help them or effective and work. So by no means are we the silver bullet. In the case of methane emissions, there are companies that do this from satellites, or fixed wing aircraft, there's fixed sensors, there's handheld units. There's a range of solutions. And so, yes, the technology is exploding in this case. It's overwhelming.
And how do you differentiate? Is it that you've been doing this a while, or that your technology is better, or your relationships, or what? That must be challenging, right? Because everybody's potentially saying the same thing. So how do you differentiate?
That's a good question. So yes, again, we're not the solution. And so what we try to do is have a conversation at the business unit level in these countries with our operations people, like, what are you trying to accomplish? So our particular sensor technology is very granular, very precise. We can point to a particular piece of equipment and say, this is where your leak is. Now, that requires a drone to fly around a site for 45 minutes or so. Other technologies with a fixed wing aircraft can survey multiples of sites and regions in a lot less time. They can cover, miles and kilometers of sites with an airplane versus a satellite. So it just depends upon what the operator is trying to accomplish. So we try to verify that.
Okay. And do you find a difference between working with larger versus smaller companies, either in terms of their likelihood to be compliant, or to be easier or more difficult to work with, or?
It varies. I've worked with both. I've worked with small private companies, and you would think that they would be faster on the decision-making process, and they're not. Okay, in the larger companies, there is a defined process. There's multiple stakeholders for good reasons. They all have their roles and agendas and needs they need to fulfill. And so it varies. But at the end of the day, it kind of cycles down to the budget and the operating expense that they have available for this type of activity. So initially what we saw is technology was accepted. This is good. Okay, this works. We don't have budget for this now. But like, okay, corporate is mandating that we have these new metrics and KPIs. We're going to do this. So we'll do this next year. So we'll expect to see a ramp up in this kind of across the board.
I'd like to know the answer to this one too. So can you give an example of a survey that you did that has had an impact? You know, kind of walk us through start to finish. What does this enable a company to do or say, or what measures do they take as a result of the information you provide, et cetera? Kind of a case study.
Okay, so as a case point, let's talk about oil and gas, an upstream gas production site. So this is a site that has wells that are producing natural gas that will be, you know, separated, compressed, and sent off for natural gas consumption. So the site itself has got wells, separators, tanks, various bits of equipment. And the company now needs to measure, they need to find their fugitive methane emissions and quantify it. So it's one thing to find the emissions, but then it's important to prioritize that because there may be a lot or few. So in a case of a production site in Argentina, we did in the last few months, we flew a survey of a site in about 45 minutes. We generated a report within 4 to 5 working days. Our report had a high definition picture of the site top down. Then we integrated the emission locations and we quantified it in terms of kilograms per hour. This is how much methane that we found. And then what that did, then enabled the operator to say, okay, over here on this section of this pad, we're leaking this much, and this is a super emitter, or it's emitting a lot of methane. So therefore we'll dedicate our repair resources to fix that. So it helps them fix it and eliminate it. And then in some cases, we find, you know, methane emissions where they knew they had none. They thought we had no leaks there. Nope, there's a leak here. You know. And then the other part of all of this is when we do this type of activity, it's really important to understand the operational context. So when we're doing the survey, what kind of activity is happening on the site? Are they offloading equipment or fuel or gas? Are they changing up pumps? Because that in turn can impact the emissions level. So you've got to take into account the type of operational activity.
Okay.
I'm really getting in the weeds there, but yeah.
Thank you. And what about countries or regions that you're not yet working in that you would like, or where you either see more opportunity or you would like to be more engaged?
So in my region, that's Brazil. Brazil is a big country geographically. Yeah. And what's interesting there is the biogas market is developing and growing. There are a lot of biogas operators who are taking biomass from sugarcane or ethanol production derived from sugarcane. So they're converting that into biomass that in turn is used to generate electricity. They're taking biogas from landfills, purifying that gas, and selling that as compressed gas for truck fleets. This is not oil and gas related. This is just a kind of a new market, and it's just really taking off. But the market itself geographically is just spread out. So for example, if I fly from Sao Paulo up to Fortaleza in the north, that's about a 4 or 5 hour flight. If you're going to ship a piece of equipment up there from Sao Paulo to Fortaleza, you're talking 2 days. So these are big distances. And then within Brazil itself, you've got the different states, so you have different tax structures and tax regimes. So yeah, it's very fascinating. But I think that Brazil would be a place.
Okay, great, thank you. And more culture questions. How does your company prepare your team with business practices and cultural norms of other countries? Do you have a department or ongoing training?
So in our case, we're a small company, and the people, well, my colleagues that I work with in these international areas, we're all come from different organizations. We have a long experience, track record working in different countries around the world. So our CEO, as an example, was a former technology ventures director for Schlumberger. He's worked around the globe for Schlumberger. The gentleman in charge of our business development has got a long history in the oil field and in Europe and Africa and Asia Pacific. So all of us have this experience set already that we bring to this company. So we're not trained in that per se. We all learn that through just hard knocks.
All right. How about, what are some negotiating points you use to develop contracts and relationships? I'll bet you have some good negotiating stories. I think you might have even told me one or two in the past. Can you think of any offhand?
Yes, there's several. So in the companies that we work with today are the larger international oil companies. And so they've got very well-defined contracts, supply chain processes, and the negotiations tend to be on language and terms and conditions. So it's a bit more refined process. When you get into the smaller companies in different regions, it becomes a little faster pace and a little less structured. And so I think what I shared with you in the past, in a previous company, I had situations where I sold some equipment. It was going to be installed in Peru, and they wanted me to ship it without a down payment. And so we structured a payment process where, okay, you give me a significant down payment that'll cover my fixed costs, my factory. I receive that, and before I put it on a boat to ship it to Latin America, you're going to pay me another tranche payment. And so we got into a bit of a tussle back and forth because they just didn't want to pay me. And I just got to the point I said, well, okay, well, I'm not going to ship this, and you can't have it until you pay me. And so it finally got their attention, and we got paid. So it requires some finesse, in those situations. But generally speaking, with the large companies that we deal with, we never get into
that. Okay. And again, questions about the sort of the skill set. So imagine that you are a student, let's say. What courses, you've already mentioned languages. What kinds of courses would be useful to you if you want to work in the global context? Let's take it outside of SeekOps, because you've had a global career elsewhere as well. So for a global career, how should you prepare yourself?
So understanding international trade, Incoterms, how to move goods and services across borders is very important. Shipping ocean freight, shipping air freight, moving people between countries, getting visas, bringing equipment and people in temporary import bonds, that's really important. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, I cannot emphasize that enough. So just an understanding of general guidelines, limits, case studies. I mean, people break that to this day, even these large companies, and it's easily done. So that's really important.
Staying out of jail.
Yes.
A federal prison, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just don't break the law, don't get killed. So yeah. But it's more fundamental than that. And so I encourage you to understand FCPA, international trade, and understand the basics of foreign exchange. It's very important, and kind of recognizing, how would I process a transaction in different currencies.
Okay. That's a really broad spectrum. And would you, you mentioned moving things around, that's logistics. Would you say supply chain?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Little international finance.
Yes.
Helpful. Okay.
Because in a lot of these transactions, it's like, okay, well, now we've agreed upon a commercial transaction. How do we move goods from one country to another? What's your schedule? Okay, what's the risk? Is there, for example, ocean freight traffic You know, when I recall from my experience, like if you're shipping between Asia and the West Coast of the United States, there's certain times of the year where you just can't get a container ship. At least it used to be the case in the past, because Walmart, Costco, and the like would book all the container ships from China to the US in the months of July and August to fill their warehouses for Christmas. So your freight rates would go up, or good luck finding a boat, that kind of thing. So.
And have supply chain issues that we're all hearing about from the pandemic, have they affected your current business model of the company you're currently working with?
So where we see the impact is in some of our sensors. We have some electronics, some optics that are just in very short supply, are no longer available because they've been diverted to the Ukraine.
Oh, okay. Oh, yes. Okay.
So our sensor is not ITAR classified, that is International Trade in Arms Regulations. We're not in that. We're outside of that. But the components, some optics and so forth, are used in different industries, and they're in short supply.
Yeah. So world events, whatever they might be, are very likely to have on a for a business model that is as diverse as yours, or that has as many components as yours. It's very likely that that global changes are going to affect you in one area or another.
Yes and no. I mean, we're fortunate in that because of our business model, because it's a service, and what we essentially do long run is locate sensors in these countries around the world. So we just ship them in advance. They're small, they're not that large, and they can reside in a country. So we're not moving heavy equipment back and forth or shipping containers. I mean, I've worked in those kind of types of businesses before, and that's very distinct. So we're fortunate in that we're not impacted as much by these global supply chain issues.
Okay. And then maybe a final question. How does your business model change when you operate in different regions, or does it change at all? Do you use the same approach, or is there some level of customization?
It's the same, pretty much. Now, the solution we offer on a field level, it is customized, it's engineered. So we have to look at every site that we're going to survey, because the data analyst time takes more. We might have to look at site conditions, weather conditions, and so forth. But it's pretty much the same across the board.
Right. Well, Mike, that was, you talk fast, and that was a lot of questions that you've taken. I'm just kind of going through through this list again. I'm looking at one that is, do you think it's more important to be a jack of all trades with technical skill sets, or to master one?
Ooh, good question. I think both paths are fine. In my case, I've just become kind of a jack of all trades of sorts, and I've developed this skill set for international work, in particular in Latin America, and a lot of it's been underpinned by my language skills. But if you've got a technical skill set that is in demand, you can go far with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then maybe one very last one. Are you seeing, so this is an interesting question. I think I know the answer to it, but I'd like you to speak to it. Do you see a possible cap in this industry potential in the short term, since many oil exporters come from the developing world and lack legal protection and government stability, and who might be hostile to your business operations?
Good question. I don't think that's an issue for us or going forward, or even today, because in these countries, oil production, gas production generates revenue and tax revenue for these countries. So it's in their interest to produce as much as they can to generate revenue for these countries. So, yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like SeekOps has a bright future. And we had a question about future applications for your technology. And I think that person might have missed your earlier comment that CO2 emissions.
CO2 is big. That's next.
we're
Yes.
next for
Yeah,
you.
there's
So,
a demand for CO2 emissions. Yes.
all right,
Quantification.
marvelous.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. What a fascinating business model, and what a great model you are for our students in terms of depth and also breadth of knowledge and international skills. And I always like it when I can showcase someone who has the kind of skills that we are advocating. So I can't thank you enough for joining us this evening, and we will post this discussion online, and we'll let everybody know how to access it on our website in case you want to share it with others. And thank you all very much for being here with us tonight.